Back in the early 2000s, a retired engineer named John found himself drawn to a quiet little spot called Willow Creek. It wasn't flashy or crowded with tourists. Instead, it was one of those hidden gems you stumble upon by accident and instantly fall in love with. Nestled between rolling green hills, this small community had something special, a man-made lake that sparkled under the sun like a jewel. For someone who loved fishing, kayaking, and just sitting by the water watching birds glide across the surface, it felt like paradise. John didn't need anything fancy. He bought a modest cabin right on the edge of the lake where he could wake up every morning to the sound of water lapping against the shore. The neighbors were friendly too, mostly older folks who appreciated the peaceful vibe of the place. Everyone lived by simple rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, which kept things tidy and ensured no one painted their house neon orange or parked broken-down cars in their driveways. Life moved at an easy pace, and for years, nothing much changed. But then around 2018, whispers started spreading through the neighborhood. At first, they were soft murmurs, people talking about how heavy rains had caused some flooding near the dam that held back the lake. No big deal, everyone thought. After all, storms came and went, and the lake had been there for decades without causing trouble. But soon, those whispers turned into louder voices when the HOA called a meeting to discuss what they called a serious issue. At the meeting, the HOA board stood up and dropped a bombshell. They said the dam holding back the lake was unstable after recent storms and posed a flood risk to nearby homes. To protect everyone, they explained, the only solution was to drain the entire lake. Just like that, without any warning, the heart of Willow Creek was going to disappear. You can imagine how people reacted. Some nodded along, trusting the HOA's judgment. Others, including John, couldn't believe what they were hearing. John raised his hand during the meeting and spoke up. "I've lived here for over 10 years, he said firmly. "We've had plenty of rain before and the dam has always been fine. Why now? Where's the proof that this is even necessary?" His questions hung in the air, but the HOA brushed them off. They claimed engineers had inspected the dam and confirmed the danger. When pressed for details, though, answers were vague. No reports were shared, no data presented. It all felt off. Despite the protests, the HOA pushed ahead with their plan. Within weeks, massive pumps arrived, and the draining began. Day by day, the once beautiful lake shrank until it vanished completely. What replaced it was a barren wasteland of mud and cracked earth. Dead fish lay scattered everywhere, their silvery bodies glinting sadly in the sunlight. Birds that used to visit stopped coming altogether. The transformation was so sudden, so drastic, that it left many residents feeling like they'd lost a part of themselves. For John, the pain ran deeper than nostalgia. Something about the whole situation smelled fishy, not just because of the rotting fish left behind. Why would the HOA suddenly care so much about flood risks after ignoring them for decades? And why did they seem so eager to act without giving residents a chance to question their decisions? As days passed, John noticed strange activity around the drained area. Construction crews started showing up, hauling equipment and setting up barriers. That's when the bigger picture began to emerge. It turns out the HOA wasn't planning to leave the drained land empty. Far from it. They were preparing to build luxury homes, big, expensive houses designed to attract wealthy buyers looking for waterfront property, or rather what used to be waterfront property. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People who had paid good money for homes overlooking the lake now faced the prospect of staring at someone else's mansion instead. And if that wasn't bad enough, doubts about the safety of building on such unstable ground started creeping in. The more John looked into it, the angrier he got. This wasn't just about ruining the lake, it was about greed disguised as concern. The HOA had sold them a story about flood prevention, but the truth was far murkier. As construction continued, tensions simmered beneath the surface of Willow Creek. Longtime residents felt betrayed, while newcomers eagerly awaited their dream homes, unaware of the storm brewing around them. As the construction crews worked tirelessly on the drained land, John couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. He'd spent enough time around lakes and water systems in his engineering career to know how delicate these environments could be. The idea of building million-dollar homes where a lake once stood didn't sit well with him. So, he decided to dig deeper, literally and figuratively. One day, while taking a walk near the construction site, John noticed something odd. The ground beneath the former lake bed didn't look like solid earth at all. Instead, it was spongy and soft, almost like walking on a wet sponge. Curious, he knelt down and scooped up a handful of soil. It was dark, sticky, and smelled faintly of decay. This wasn't normal dirt, it was peat, the kind of material you'd find in swamps or marshes. John's mind raced. If this land was originally swampy, then why had anyone built a lake here in the first place? And more importantly, how could anyone think it was safe to put heavy houses on such unstable ground? Determined to get answers, he reached out to local geologists and environmental experts. What they told him confirmed his worst fears. The area where Willow Creek's lake now sat, or rather used to sit, had once been wetlands. Decades ago, developers had illegally filled in parts of the swamp to create the artificial lake. Back then, environmental regulations weren't as strict, and shady deals often paved the way for projects like this. By flooding the low-lying, swampy area, they created what looked like a picturesque man-made lake, hiding the truth about its origins. But the real kicker came when John learned that wetlands were supposed to stay wet. Without water, the soil underneath would lose its stability. Think of it like a sponge again. If you squeeze all the water out, the structure collapses. That's exactly what was happening now. By draining the lake, the HOA hadn't just destroyed an ecosystem. They'd exposed the fragile foundation beneath it. And building luxury homes on top of that? It was a recipe for disaster. Armed with this knowledge, John attended another HOA meeting, ready to confront them head-on. When it was his turn to speak, he held up a bag of the muddy, peaty soil he'd collected. "Does this look like stable ground to anyone?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. "You're building million-dollar homes on swampland. This isn't about flood safety. It's about covering up your mistakes and making a quick buck." The room fell silent. Some residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged worried glances. But the HOA board didn't flinch. One of them, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair and an air of authority, dismissed John's claims. "We've followed all the proper procedures," he said smoothly. "Every permit has been approved and inspections have been conducted. There's nothing to worry about." John wasn't convinced. He pushed back, asking for copies of the inspection, reports and permits. The board promised to provide them, but weeks went by and no documents appeared. Frustrated but undeterred, John decided to take matters into his own hands. He began researching old records, combing through dusty files at the local courthouse, and scouring online archives. What he uncovered shocked even him. It turned out that the original developers of Willow Creek hadn't just bent the rules, they'd broken them. Decades earlier, they had bribed local officials to look the other way while they filled in protected wetlands to build the lake. At the time, the project seemed harmless enough. A beautiful lake would attract buyers, boosting property values and lining everyone's pockets. But the consequences of tampering with nature always catch up eventually. When the HOA took over years later, they inherited not only the profits from the lake, but also the legal liability of maintaining illegal infrastructure, draining the lake. And replacing it with high-end homes wasn't just a business decision, it was a desperate attempt to erase evidence of the past. Without the constant presence of water, the swampy soil would reveal itself, exposing the truth about the land's unstable foundation. For John, this revelation was both infuriating and heartbreaking. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a community. People had built lives here, raised families, and formed friendships. Now, thanks to greed and corruption, everything was falling apart. Worse still, the new homeowners moving in had no idea what they were getting themselves into. They thought they were buying dream homes, but in reality, they were sitting on a ticking time bomb. As John dug deeper into the tangled web of corruption surrounding Willow Creek, he realized that exposing the truth wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, connections with influential people, and a knack for deflecting criticism. But John wasn't about to back down. He knew that if he could rally enough support from his neighbors, they might stand a chance against the powerful forces working against them. The first step was building trust within the community. Many longtime residents were already suspicious of the HOA's motives, but others, especially newer homeowners, were still skeptical of John's claims. They hadn't lived in Willow Creek long enough to see how things used to be, and some even questioned whether John was just bitter because he'd lost his view of the lake. To win them over, John decided to lay out the facts as clearly as possible. He gathered maps, old photographs, and engineering reports showing how the land had changed over the years. One particularly telling piece of evidence was an aerial photo, taken decades earlier. It showed the area before the lake existed, a vast expanse of marshy wetlands dotted with reeds and shallow pools. When compared to the present-day construction site, the contrast was undeniable. This wasn't stable ground. It was a swamp that had been artificially flooded to create the illusion of solidity. John also reached out to local environmental groups, hoping to enlist their help. At first, they were hesitant. Fighting a well-funded HOA seemed like a losing battle, and many organizations didn't want to risk alienating potential donors or partners. But when John shared his findings about the illegal filling of protected wetlands, something shifted. Wetland conservation was a hot-button issue, and exposing this kind of blatant disregard for environmental laws was too important to ignore. Slowly but surely, allies began stepping forward. With newfound support, John organized a town hall meeting, not one run by the HOA, but by the residents themselves. Word spread quickly, and on the night of the event, the small community center was packed. People brought folding chairs, stood along the walls, and even spilled outside onto the lawn. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt united, not divided. John took the stage, flanked by representatives from the environmental groups he'd contacted. He started by sharing his personal story, how much the lake had meant to him and how devastated he'd been to see it drained. Then he presented the hard evidence, the aerial photos, soil samples, and expert opinions confirming that the land was unstable. By the time he finished speaking, you could hear a pin drop. Even those who had doubted him before looked shaken. But John didn't stop there. He invited a retired geologist named Dr. Thompson, a friend of a friend, to speak next. Dr. Thompson explained in simple terms why building homes on former wetlands was a terrible idea. Think of it like Jell-O, he said, holding up a glass of wobbly red gelatin for dramatic effect. If you put weight on top of it, it collapses. That's exactly what's happening here. Without water to hold the soil together, these foundations are doomed. The crowd murmured uneasily. A few brave souls raised their hands to ask questions, while others whispered among themselves. One woman, a recent transplant to Willow Creek, stood up and spoke emotionally. "I bought my house last year thinking I was getting my dream home," she said, her voice trembling. "Now I'm wondering if I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Her words resonated with many in the room, sparking a wave of anger directed squarely at the HOA. Encouraged by the turnout and energy at the meeting, John proposed forming a task force to investigate further and hold the HOA accountable. Volunteers signed up immediately, eager to contribute however they could. Some offered to review legal documents while others volunteered to canvass the neighborhood, spreading awareness about the situation. Others reached out to local media outlets, hoping to shine a spotlight on the scandal. It didn't take long for the story to gain traction. A young journalist from a regional newspaper attended the town hall and wrote a scathing expose about the HOA's actions. The article went viral, drawing attention not only from nearby towns, but also from national environmental advocates. Suddenly, Willow Creek was thrust into the spotlight and the pressure on the HOA mounted. At first, the HOA tried to brush off the accusations. They issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and accused John and his supporters of spreading misinformation. But as more evidence surfaced and as more residents came forward with their own concerns, their denials began to ring hollow. Behind closed doors, cracks started forming within the HOA itself. Board members argued over how to handle the growing backlash, and several resigned under the weight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, nature herself seemed determined to expose the truth. Just weeks after the town hall meeting, record-breaking rainfall hit Willow Creek. The deluge overwhelmed drainage systems and turned the newly built home sites into muddy quagmires. Construction equipment sank ankle-deep into the soggy ground, halting work entirely. Worst of all, cracks began appearing in the foundations of the few homes that had already been completed. Panic rippled through the community as new homeowners realized their investments were literally crumbling beneath their feet. For John, watching the chaos unfold was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt vindicated. His warnings had proven true. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel sorrow for the families caught in the middle. These weren't villains. They were ordinary people who had trusted the HOA to do the right thing. Now they were left dealing with the fallout. Despite the mounting challenges, John refused to give up. He saw this moment as an opportunity to push for real change, not just in Willow Creek, but in communities everywhere facing similar threats. With the help of his growing network of supporters, he drafted a petition demanding a full investigation into the HOA's practices and calling for stricter enforcement of environmental regulations. Hundreds of signatures poured in, and soon local politicians took notice. One county commissioner, known for her outspoken stance on environmental issues, agreed to visit Willow Creek and assess the damage firsthand. As she walked through the muddy remains of the drained lake, shaking her head at the cracked foundations and sinking homes, John allowed himself a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. But the fight was far from over. While progress was being made, the road ahead promised to be long and difficult. Lawsuits were filed, counterclaims were made, and tensions continued to simmer. Yet through it all, John remained steadfast, driven by a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself or even for Willow Creek. He was fighting for the principle that profit should never come at the expense of people or the planet. And so, with determination burning in his chest, John prepared for the next chapter in this unfolding drama. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how hard someone tried to bury it. As the storm clouds, both literal and metaphorical, gathered over Willow Creek, the cracks in the HOA's facade grew wider with each passing day. The once unified front they had presented to the community was now crumbling faster than the foundations of the luxury homes they'd built on unstable ground. For John and his growing group of supporters, this was the moment they had been waiting for, a chance to expose the truth and hold those responsible accountable. The county commissioner's visit marked a turning point. She arrived on a gray, drizzly morning, her boots sinking slightly into the soggy soil as she surveyed the damage. John walked beside her, pointing out the telltale signs of instability, the deep fissures in the earth, the leaning lampposts, and the half-finished houses that looked like they might collapse at any moment. "This isn't just a construction issue," he said firmly. "This is about ignoring nature and trying to cover up mistakes with greed." The commissioner listened, intently asking pointed questions and jotting notes in a small spiral-bound notebook. When she spoke, her tone was measured but firm. "If what you're saying is true, and everything I'm seeing suggests it is, then this goes far beyond Willow Creek. This is a systemic failure to protect our environment and prioritize safety over profit." Her words sent a ripple of hope through the crowd of residents who had gathered to witness the inspection. But while the commissioner's presence signaled progress, the legal battle was only beginning. New homeowners, many of whom had taken out massive loans to afford their dream properties, were furious. Some filed lawsuits against the HOA, accusing them of fraud and negligence. Others demanded refunds or compensation for the rapidly depreciating value of their homes. Meanwhile, longtime residents joined forces with environmental activists to file a class action lawsuit, arguing that the HOA had violated not only local laws, but also the trust of the entire community. The courtroom drama that followed was nothing short of chaotic. Lawyers representing the HOA argued that the flooding and structural issues were caused by unforeseen weather events rather than poor planning. They insisted that all necessary permits had been obtained and that the HOA couldn't be held responsible for acts of nature. On the other side, John and his allies presented reams of evidence showing that the land had never been suitable for development in the first place. Engineers testified about the dangers of building on former wetlands, while historians provided context about how the lake had been created illegally decades earlier. For weeks, the case dominated headlines in local newspapers and even made national news. Reporters flocked to Willow Creek, eager to capture interviews with distraught homeowners, defiant activists, and beleaguered HOA members. One particularly memorable segment featured a retired teacher who broke down in tears as she described watching her basement flood for the third time in 2 months. "I worked my whole life to buy this house," she said, clutching a photo of her grandchildren. "Now I can't sleep at night wondering if it's going to fall apart around me." Amidst the chaos, tensions within Willow Creek reached a boiling point. The community became sharply divided between those who supported John and those who still clung to the HOA's promises. Arguments erupted at grocery stores, school pickup lines, and neighborhood gatherings. Old friendships soured, and neighborly goodwill evaporated. Even families were torn apart. One man recounted how his brother, a staunch defender of the HOA, had stopped speaking to him after he joined the lawsuit. Despite the divisions, John remained a calming presence. He understood that emotions were running high and did his best to keep the focus on finding solutions rather than assigning blame. At weekly meetings, he reminded everyone why they were fighting, not just for themselves, but for future generations. "We didn't ask for this battle," he often said, "but we have an opportunity to set things right. Let's not waste it." Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in the HOA's defense. Internal emails leaked to the press revealed heated debates among board members about how to handle the crisis. In one particularly damning exchange, a former HOA president admitted that draining the lake had been a calculated risk meant to boost property values. Another document showed that engineers hired by the HOA had flagged concerns about the soil's stability long before construction began, but their warnings had been ignored. Public outrage reached a fever pitch when these revelations came to light. Protesters gathered outside the HOA's headquarters holding signs that read, "Swamp Scam," and "Fix What You Broke." Local businesses started pulling sponsorships from HOA events, and several prominent real estate agents distanced themselves from the organization. It was clear that the tide was turning against them. Behind closed doors, the HOA scrambled to salvage its reputation. Board members resigned en masse, leaving the organization in disarray. Emergency funds were allocated to stabilize the sinking homes, though many questioned whether throwing money at the problem would actually solve anything. Contractors brought in specialized equipment to reinforce the foundations, but progress was slow and costly. Some homeowners opted to walk away entirely, abandoning their properties rather than face mounting repair bills. Through it all, John kept pushing forward. With the help of environmental lawyers, he drafted a proposal to restore the drained lake and surrounding wetlands. The plan called for dismantling the unfinished homes, reintroducing native plants, and creating a buffer zone to prevent future development. While ambitious, it offered a glimmer of hope for healing the land and the community. Not everyone was on board with the idea. Some argued that restoring the lake would mean giving up on the dream of luxury waterfront living altogether. Others, worried about the financial implications, pointing out that such a project would require significant funding. But John countered these concerns with a simple yet powerful argument. What's the alternative? Keep building on unstable ground until the entire neighborhood collapses, or admit our mistakes and work toward something better? By the time the judge issued her ruling, Willow Creek was a community teetering on the edge of transformation. The decision was a mixed bag. The HOA was ordered to halt further development and begin restoration efforts, but full accountability remained elusive. Still, it was enough to give John and his allies a sense of vindication. After years of fighting, they had forced the powers that be to acknowledge the harm they had caused and take steps to make amends. As the dust settled, John reflected on how far they'd come. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Willow Creek had been tested in ways no one could have imagined, but perhaps out of the wreckage, something stronger could emerge, something rooted not in greed but in respect for the land, for the law, and for each other. With the judge's ruling finally in place, Willow Creek began the long and arduous process of healing. For John and his fellow residents, it was a moment of both triumph and reckoning. The legal battle had drained their energy, strained relationships, and left many financially stretched. But despite everything they'd been through, there was an undeniable sense of purpose driving them forward. This wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about rebuilding something stronger, more sustainable, and deeply rooted in the values that truly mattered. The first step toward restoration was dismantling the unfinished homes. Bulldozers rolled into the area, carefully tearing down structures that had never stood a chance on such unstable ground. It was a sobering sight for the new homeowners who had invested so much hope and money into these properties. Some watched silently as their dreams crumbled before their eyes, while others voiced their frustration at town meetings. "I didn't sign up for this," one man said bitterly during a heated discussion. "You're taking away the only thing I have left." John listened patiently to these grievances, knowing all too well how painful it was to lose something you cared about. He shared his own story of watching the lake vanish overnight, and explained that the goal wasn't to punish anyone but to create a future where mistakes like this wouldn't happen again. Slowly, some of the newer residents began to soften. They realized that blaming each other wouldn't solve anything. What they needed now was unity and action. As the demolition work continued, attention turned to restoring the land itself. Environmental experts arrived with plans to rehabilitate the wetlands and bring back the lake. Native plants were reintroduced to stabilize the soil, and channels were dug to allow water to flow naturally once more. Fish populations, which had been decimated when the lake was drained, were gradually restocked. Birds drawn by the returning ecosystem began to reappear, a small but hopeful sign that life could flourish here again. The transformation wasn't immediate. Restoring a damaged environment takes time, patience, and resources. Funding became a major hurdle early on, as the costs of undoing decades of neglect added up quickly. To cover the expenses, John and his team launched a crowdfunding campaign, reaching out not just to locals but also to people across the country who had followed their story. Donations poured in from unexpected places: teachers, students, retirees, even strangers who simply believed in the cause. "This isn't just your fight," one donor wrote. "It's ours too." Local businesses also stepped up, offering discounts on materials or volunteering their services. A nearby nursery donated hundreds of native saplings, while a construction company provided heavy machinery free of charge. Even kids got involved, organizing bake sales and car washes to raise funds. What started as a grassroots effort grew into a community-wide movement, proving that when people come together, incredible things can happen. Amidst the physical restoration, there was also a focus on healing the emotional scars left by the conflict. Town hall meetings shifted from heated arguments to collaborative discussions about the future. Longtime residents and newcomers found common ground in their shared desire to protect Willow Creek, not just as a place to live, but as a legacy for future generations. Friendships that had been strained during the legal battles slowly began to mend, reminding everyone of the importance of compassion and understanding. One particularly touching moment came during a volunteer cleanup day. Dozens of residents gathered to plant trees along the edges of the newly refilled lake. As they worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter, the divisions that had once defined the community seemed to fade away. At the end of the day, someone brought out a guitar, and impromptu songs echoed across the water. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt whole again. Of course, challenges remained. Not everyone agreed on every aspect of the restoration plan, and there were moments when old tensions flared up. Some argued that the HOA should be dissolved entirely, while others believed it could still play a role if reformed properly. Debates over zoning laws and environmental protections continued, reflecting the broader struggles faced by communities everywhere, trying to balance growth with sustainability. But through it all, John remained steadfast. He knew that perfection wasn't the goal, progress was. Every tree planted, every bird returned, every child splashing in the water was proof that they were moving in the right direction. And though the scars of the past would always linger, the cracked foundations, the lawsuits, the broken friendships, they served as reminders of how far they'd come. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly 2 years after the draining of the lake, John stood by the shore watching sunlight dance across the rippling surface. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of wetlands coming back to life. Families strolled along the newly built walking paths, pointing out ducks gliding across the water. Kids skipped stones, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It wasn't exactly the same as before. The scars of human interference were still visible, but it was close enough to feel like home. For John, the journey had been about more than just saving a lake. It had taught him the power of persistence, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from working together. He thought back to the countless hours spent poring over documents, organizing meetings, and facing opposition. There were times when he doubted himself, when the weight of the fight felt almost unbearable. But looking around now, he knew it had been worth it. Willow Creek's story wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't over. Challenges would continue to arise, and the lessons learned here would need to be applied vigilantly to ensure history didn't repeat itself. But for the first time in a long while, the community had a second chance, a chance to honor the land, respect its limits, and build something meaningful upon it. As John walked back to his cabin, he paused to take one last look at the lake. A heron stood gracefully at the water's edge, its reflection shimmering in the golden light. In that quiet moment, he felt a deep sense of peace. Willow Creek wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And maybe, just maybe, it could serve as a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles elsewhere. After all, every swamp has the potential to become a sanctuary, if given the care and respect it deserves.